Might switch back to the phone.
It could be that that jumping to a new broadcast channel grabs a little more bandwidth. So let's see if it settles down.
I'm going to switch back to my phone, you guys.
Okay. Can you not hear us at all?
I couldn't hear anything for the last 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay. How about now?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thoughtful, but I'm not that thoughtful, you know?
How about now? JP, can you hear us now?
I hear you now. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. It's cutting in and out. So.
Okay. Oops. Yes, it is.
I think he just said he was going to switch to his phone.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Going to jump back.
Yeah, were you saying you've been having issues with your computer running slow before?
Okay.
Not terribly.
Okay. I have returned.
Hey, he's back.
It's the best way to do this here. Do this.
All right. Good to see you. I'm going to throw up a slide here. And we're off. So great to see you guys. And it's a Wednesday night or a Wednesday afternoon if you're in the Pacific Coast.
Yep.
So anybody got a muzzle full?
What I've been reading a lot about today, especially, I guess, at least, has been Kamala Harris being the VP choice, which is interesting. John and I had a conversation before about who we thought the VP would be, and she was always pretty up there, but I actually didn't think it would be Kamala Harris, because I thought he would try and appeal more to the left wing of the party. So I was reading some articles today, because it's kind of, you got to think about pretty far back. It seems like it was years ago, but just to the primary and what my impressions of her then were. And going back to the primary, I thought she started off as very progressive and then kind of backed off it. Kind of the main hallmark of that during the primary was whether or not you supported universal health care that got rid of private health insurance. And she started off on that side of things, then kind of backed off. And so I think she ended up in almost the exact same, or at least my impression or what I'm remembering from the primary was she ended up appealing to almost the exact same crowd that Biden was. So, which is why I didn't think he would pick her. Because usually, I mean, the vice presidential pick seems mostly to be about trying to appeal to a group of people that you might not have a super strong voter base there or something like that. But he did not do that, it seems. But so I was reading some articles today about how the left wing might not be super upset about this pick because she does seem to be pretty malleable, I guess. She has changed quite a bit over the years, and according to her voting record, apparently she's like the fourth most liberal candidate, according to some system. I don't know exactly what it is, but so she does have a bit of that in her. And then I think, I mean, almost similar to how they view Joe Biden, is that he does appear to be mostly a moderate, but he does have the potential to be kind of pushed farther to the left on some of these ideas. And I think they think the same thing about Kamala Harris. But yeah, it was really interesting to me because nothing I've read today said kind of made me think that what I was thinking before, that she did not make sense as a vice presidential pick. Nothing read today kind of combated that idea. So yeah, be interested what you guys have think about that, or your impressions of her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How about you, Jay? Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah, when we talked, John, I feel like we both sort of wrote her off, as I recall. Maybe not. But yeah, I think it's a safe pick.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like the equivalent of Biden. It feels like picking Biden for president is the same as picking her for vice president.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it was. I mean, I doubt they're gonna try and make it energizing, right? Is what people hope for with the vice presidential pick. And she might. I don't know that she's as energizing. I mean, having a woman of color obviously is historic.
Mm-hmm.
It's the word of the day on the New York Times. But it's like, I was talking to some folks from Portland yesterday, and they were kind of disappointed by the pick. And these are people that are pretty involved in or either were involved with the protests or were one degree removed from a lot of people that were really involved in it.
Yeah, it is interesting though, like who would have been, like, if there was a majority voice of the far left, which I don't even know if you could say there is, but
yeah,
who would have been their pick? Because Elizabeth Warren, I mean, I think her voters mostly overlapped with Pete Buttigieg. Like, I don't even know who they would have been like super happy with, and maybe that was part of the calculus that went into making this decision, because there was really no one to pick who you could have perhaps picked up left-wing voters that wouldn't have voted for Biden before.
Yeah. That's the thing, is like, in the current election, would it have really mattered who he picked? Like, yeah.
Sure.
I mean, it seems like there's plenty of people energized to vote just because someone's running against Trump.
Yeah.
And I know it's like, yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of nervous just by how much I'm hearing that rationale.
What?
The whole like, well, they're not Trump, so people are definitely going to turn out and vote. I find myself saying that a lot to sort of explain the decisions that Biden's making. And I'm concerned I'm concerned about complacency in 100 days or 90 days or whatever it is setting in. But yeah, she does kind of, she's not, I mean, I guess she is relatively progressive based on what, I mean, her voting record in the Senate, John, is that what you're looking at? I mean,
She's like
historically, she hasn't been very progressive. And what was the adjective I heard a bunch today? I heard it like 5 times. Pragmatic.
Yeah.
Pragmatic was the word that kept coming up.
I actually read an article that had something to say about that as well, which was basically when she first started her career in politics, basically it was as a DA. And when she was a district attorney, she decided not to prosecute someone who had killed a police officer. And this was like a long time ago, and Democrats were certainly not as broadly not in favor of the police as they are now. And so she caught a ton of flack for that. And when she ran for Attorney General of the state, she barely won against a Republican in California. And a lot of it was because they hammered on that constantly. And so the article compared someone like her to someone like Bernie Sanders. And she basically, they made a comparison that she had to be pragmatic as a Black woman who's going to stay in politics for a very long time. Like, she had to think about these things. She couldn't be ideological Puritan in the same way that Bernie Sanders could if she ever hoped to stay in politics for any length of time. So,
yeah. And she, in fact, never lost a race now in California. She was reelected for Attorney General. This, tell me if you think these things are wrong. I'm flying from memory here, but I think it's right that she was reelected to Attorney General by a much wider margin. Against a pretty, in both cases, both campaigns, it's hard to tell because you hear one story here and there, and you really got to know what are the hopes of the people who are writing the article or putting the news piece forward. That I'm not saying that people are saying things that are false, probably, but they're selecting.
Right.
So, I've heard it said these were widely contested elections, people recognizing she was somebody to probably stop if you didn't want her to be, an attractive deal in California, which she has become. So in other words, there was a lot of money poured into those campaigns, both of them, and she survived them both and flourished after the first one. Rachel Maddow did a piece on her last night. Anybody see it?
I didn't.
She did a piece in which she particularly highlighted what certainly is an impressive story on its face, where Harris was representing the state of California as a brand new attorney general in a 50 state suit against. This must have been the year that Obama was elected, I think. That she was first elected as AG in California, and there was a housing crisis suit, housing collapse suit against, I don't know, big mortgage companies, probably, whatever it was. She basically turned down a multi-billion-dollar package and pulled California out of a settlement that would have brought a lot of money into California. And it looked like the thing was dead. And this is the story told by somebody who's probably pretty sympathetic from everything I've seen to the Kamala Harris case in general. But so take that with a grain of salt. But the story is that, it looked bad for the suit but as a matter of fact, she put together a coalition. I shouldn't say that. I don't know that. She was part of another round of smaller leading states that sort of resurrected the 50 state coalition and got maybe twice out of the settlement, a huge settlement. Maybe it was 16 or 18 billion dollars, around that order of magnitude, is the sort of money that was brought into the state of California for mortgage relief. And so she looked right there on that telling, like somebody who could play with billion-dollar stakes and competency, and so that's a piece.
Yeah.
And I have to look pretty. She looked pretty impressive when you looked at the newsreel put together by people who are dying to make her look impressive.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Didn't she drop out of the presidential race before the Iowa caucus?
I don't remember when she dropped out.
Was it right after?
No, I don't recall that way.
It was
Good question. It was, yeah, I think it was pretty early, but I don't think it was right after Iowa. But maybe so. I don't know. We could look that up real quick.
Yeah. I just remember reading stuff about how her camp.
Well, she was on some debates, but how many debates was she in? Quite a number.
A few, yeah.
And how many of those debates post-dated the Iowa caucuses?
Yeah.
I think a number also.
The debate thing is pretty funny though. I was listening to, I don't know, their Joe Biden and heard their opening speech together after he announced her, and she was giving him props on his history of promoting social justice and stuff like that. He's been doing it for a long time, and it's just really funny when pretty much her only notable moment of her primary was attacking him on that exact issue. But I mean, I guess that's politics, I guess, but it does make you laugh, certainly.
Yeah, she specifically attacked him about
busing.
Well, busing came up, but if I remember correctly, the busing piece was a little less. How shall I put it? That was a more slippery attack, a little bit, or maybe I'm misremembering that piece. But the lead in that attack was her support for Strom Thurmond, and who else was it? A second Republican senator who who made a name promoting segregation. Thurmond and someone else.
Yeah, there was a word
piece of it too.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was the start of the attack. But when she said something, she was talking about a little girl who got to school because of the busing program that he was against, and then she ends it with, "I was that little girl," and everyone gasped and clapped. But
yeah, I thought my recollection is there was a little bit of sleight of hand in that, but maybe I'm misremembering.
Well, there was the fact that I think when she supported the same program he did when she got into office or something. But
or maybe there were federal versus state busing mandates.
Perhaps. Or it might have been something like, do you support federal busing now? Or I don't know. But
right. Anyway. Well, let's back up. Tell me what you think. It's one thing to say, what do you think of the politics of the Biden-Harris ticket? Another thing is well, who was the Democratic field in the first place? Who could he have picked? That's an interesting facet here. It's when's the last time that somebody pigeonholed himself or herself, almost always himself, as tightly as Biden did?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I was hearing about today, and it's why so many people thought it would be Kamala Harris, is because typically you pick a congressman or a governor. He said he was definitely going to pick a woman, and then with the current situation in the country, they were almost certainly going to be black. So he was pretty. He didn't have a big pool of candidates to choose if he was going to satisfy all of those conditions.
Yeah, it was like Stacey Abrams, Susan Rice, Bass, Karen Bass, and Kamala Harris. So, right, were there other? Those are the four that come to mind for me. But were there more in that? That fit the.
Those are the four that come to mind.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody mentioned Lori Lightfoot. One could have, but
Oh, a Chicago mayor.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't recall her being mentioned in that, or her having been interviewed, but she could have been as well.
Yeah.
There's another Southern mayor as well, I think, who made that list, but I remember someone I know less well. I don't even remember which city she's mayor of.
Yeah.
But what was the beginning of that question, or what were you?
It was just, I guess I was just taking note of that circumstance and dropping that into the mix for consideration for a moment. It's interesting whose name never made that list, and I'm sort of this is a little tongue in cheek, but Tulsi Gabbard's name never made that list.
Mm-hmm.
She's a woman of color, and she was a presidential candidate, and she had. I don't know that she had a worse run than Kamala Harris did. She didn't get as much mainstream media attention, I think, as Kamala Harris did at the very beginning. I think that's fair to say. But when it comes to how many votes did you bring in? In fact, she actually won delegates. She hung in there long enough to win a delegate at least. And of course was squeezed off the stage nonetheless for the first time of anybody that had ever won a delegate, right? Was squeezed off the debate stage.
Yeah.
I don't know what you all think of that politics, but it's interesting that nobody would ever consider her.
Yeah, and what makes it particularly interesting in retrospect is it seemed like the Democrats were gonna, as a party, were feeling like the party is going pretty far left here, at least at the start of the primary, and she certainly did not fit into that world.
You don't think so? Let's talk about that.
Well, she at least didn't fit into people's perception of her as far as that goes. But I would like to talk more about that. But it is funny that they moved to basically the most centrist candidate possible, and she still was not even in the picture. So, but yeah, let's go back to what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, Tulsi Gabbard seems pretty strongly, certainly off the beaten track with regard to U.S. foreign policy and militarism. Right? She is vocal anti-war.
Yeah,
it seems to me anti-U.S. militarism, anti-global hegemony for the United States. almost sounds like somebody. She doesn't talk about the U.S. empire, or the U.S. led empire. She doesn't use
Mhm.
that language, but she seems to me to be sympathetic with folks who do use that language.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't make you, I mean, isn't it interesting? That's outside the Overton window almost, right? You don't get coverage about that. There's no big issue there. That's not it's that's not right or left. That's more like rude, right? Where you need a different category for it, which
Yeah, I
makes
mean,
it unthinkable, right? It makes her an Assad apologist, a Russian apologist, et cetera, right? It makes her a dartboard, right? I mean, it makes her a target, it seems to me.
so I think um,
Oh,
that's pretty standard for at least the far left candidates. I think. I mean, I certainly think Bernie Sanders is like that. Um, so yeah, people just picked up on a couple of those situations, and then rode them into the dirt as far as painting her as a bad actor or something. But I mean, I don't know exactly how it applies or how standard it is, but certainly my impression of the far left of the party is probably has pretty similar views in regards to foreign wars and things like that. Which, yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is most people don't really care about that as much, though. Like that just doesn't grab as much attention for people. Is uh, politics, foreign politics rather than domestic. Um, and so, yeah, if that was one of her biggest points of being very progressive, or I don't know what you might think, it might not even fall into that. They also were able to attack her on that, even though that was her her biggest claim to being progressive.
Well, there are a lot of people, in my experience, who would have only considered Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I know a lot of people like that too.
And yet she's what? She doesn't represent the left wing of the party. She's not left wing enough. She's conservative. She's right. Who knows what she is? What she is somebody who's slippery and dangerous because she thinks for herself. I don't mean nobody else thinks for themselves in some ways, but I do think that everybody else falls into pretty much the political mainstream, and Gabbard resists that.
yeah. I know almost nothing about her except, I mean, I remember the news coverage early in the presidential election labeling her as someone who was going to try and like a potential third party run who was going to ruin things for Democrats.
Right.
That's my recollection of the coverage she got. And she's like
Yeah.
a Russian agent or a sympathetic to Assad and um, uh, uh, Islamophobic.
Yeah, I mean, some of the most disgusting media coverage of the primary for sure.
Yeah,
It was
Isn't it
really egregious.
isn't it amazing that there is no movement to push back against that? I shouldn't say no movement because I mean you can find it, but boy, you gotta look for it, right? You won't find it in any mainstream accounts. I mean, it's
yeah.
just it's not discussed.
What's not discussed exactly?
Um, Gabbard
How?
as a candidate,
Oh,
Gabbard as someone who um, I think Gabbard as a candidate was not discussed, but I was trying to react specifically to phrasing that was just used in our previous exchange there. And it's slipping from me a little bit. The, something like the extent to which the extent to which critics of all mainstream media there's a large list of them. Glenn Greenwald comes to mind as a very famous one, right? And many others. But the folks who make a list that he would be on, right? Those critics would think that that Gabbard, that the fix is in for someone like Gabbard. You just can't think outside the mainstream. You're not allowed to. I mean, you're free to, but you are a blank, and that's the end of it. Next news cycle, right? You get 1 minute, gone, and that's pretty interesting. That's the world in which the VP. It seems to me that's the world in which Kamala Harris gets picked in. He gets picked out of those candidates that Biden's allowed to pick from. And I don't, and that's I think that's the right word.
Yeah.
Yeah, allowed, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting. I bring this up because I mean it's kind of similar, but right now I'm listening to the Daily is a 2-part episode on cancel culture. Basically, it's actually a really cool dive that I think they do a pretty good job of looking at multiple angles of what cancel culture is and what it means. And yeah, one of the phrases they brought up was taking like complicated policy and reducing it to blindingly moral black and white questions where it just simplifies it, where she can have this interesting complicated policy on foreign governments and how to deal with them, but she did it in the wrong way, so she just falls into this camp, and that's the wrong opinion to have. So I mean, I think she did get canceled in a sense by having the opinions in the wrong way, or I don't remember. I did look into her quite a bit when she was first out a candidate, but my memory is a bit vague at this point on her exact or what she got in trouble for exactly, besides the foreign stuff.
Well, you might remember she also voted in a non-standard way with respect to impeachment.
Did she abstain or something?
Is that right? I think that's correct. And I'm trying to remember whether it was whether that was true for both votes. Would have to go back.
And I forget the reasoning, but it wasn't because she disagreed with it. I don't think she just thought it wasn't being done in the right way,
or yeah, it
was being done too fast, maybe.
Or the whole thing is a inappropriate use of our time and attention with more pressing priorities. That ought to be attended to.
I thought she agreed with the impeachment. My memory is getting super spotty at this point, but I thought she agreed with it, but she couldn't vote yes for some reason about process or something like that.
Well, put a pin in that and go back and look at it sometime if we want to pay more attention to her. But I do think that it's just worth. She's representative here. She is a woman of color. Yeah, I mean, in the same way that you might have voted for, you might have found a Hispanic woman. It's interesting that, and maybe a woman of color these days had to be a black woman. Maybe that's right.
I think it did.
He's Samoan, right?
That might be true. I think that's right. Polynesian of some. There may
Yeah,
be
I
an
think-
Indian also.
I think
She's Hindu, right?
Yeah, that's right. Or she
Eric?
grew up in a co-religious home. I believe her father was a conservative Christian and her mother was a Hindu. Does that sound possibly right? Anyway, we could take a deep Tulsi Gabbard dive someday, and I think that's actually worth doing, but not. We're not prepared for it, and she's not in the news now. All I really wanted to do is bring up the fact of just a couple things. How had he pigeonholed? How was he restricted through his own public statements, and then how was he restricted through non-public statements? How was he otherwise restricted? And I think both of those are important things to look at.
Yeah. You used the phrase before, he was allowed to pick from a certain group. Can you say more about what you mean by allowed? He was allowed to pick certain candidates. And do you mean that in the sense that he pigeonholed himself, or do you mean it in a sense of another sense?
More than that he pigeonholed himself. It's a good question as to how you can imagine someone being in effect forced to pigeonhole themselves. And
He
so
was
that's a piece. But I think that, but then once you do, that also changes the equation, right? Once you squeeze that much out of a candidate, that changes the equation. I think let's see. Look at, here's an analogy. I would say there's a sense in which Bernie Sanders was not allowed to run for president when he ran against Clinton or when he ran more recently. I think that there's party apparatchiks is the phrase they use these days, or maybe not these days. They used to use that phrase, and maybe it's not the phrase I want to use, but it looks like the machine. What's the machine? The prevailing opinion of those who have power in the party, and that includes the prevailing opinion of those who donate to the party in large measure. Right? And those are not the same, and they may not even have the same opinions. But I think both of those are factors. And it looks like that's been, and I'd have to prepare a little better to go back and do a history and make some specific points. But it is my impression that the last couple of elections were pretty shamelessly conducted in ways that favored some candidates more than others, and not just in the coverage that they get, although that's another dimension of, the Overton window is a thing, right? And mainstream media and corporate media, all of those things are dimensions. So I do think that you would have a very uphill battle trying to make a case publicly for certain positions, and if you step out of those lines, you are not going to make it. And there are a lot of folks who will make sure that that's the case if they possibly can. And they'll do it publicly in debate, and they'll do it quietly in power realignments of various sorts. Things like rules realignment. Think for just to take one case, pretty famously, the rules for who gets on stage and who doesn't in debate, and how those rules are changed, and who changes them and why, or the rules for what gets in a party platform, or those kinds of rules are. I mean, there's what's debated, and then there's what's done, and what just shapes the way things move forward, and that is all of the reference against which I use the phrase allowed. But admittedly, that's pretty vague, but it's a little less vague now than it was when I first used it.
Yeah.
It says nothing about it.
I would certainly say that definitely the majority of the Bernie Sanders camp would say that the DNC did not allow him to become president. I mean, just the blatant favoritism from the DNC. I mean, honestly, the shadiest thing that actually got caught that in recent memory for me was the chairwoman of the DNC, Debbie Weiserman Schultz, formerly giving the debate questions to the Hillary campaign, which was unbelievably shady, and they got caught. And then instead of being punished, she got hired onto the Clinton campaign after she left the DNC. Like, it's just like, that is some shady high level stuff going on right there. That kind of goes into who's allowing people to have access to power.
Right. Yep. That's an example. And there are others.
Yeah.
So we've exchanged and have discussed, but we've exchanged and not discussed here, but sort of off in chat. We've discussed how should we put it? Different perspectives that are highly critical of ordinary operations. Everything from this is the sort of stuff you catch filed these days under FISA abuse, right? Anything under FISA abuse would fall into that. Every voice in that conversation. It's the stuff that, and we could go back to other topics. We could be talking about WikiLeaks and their role, and Assange, right? And that all of the stuff that comes out about all of that, right? From many different perspectives. We could be talking further back about Snowden and the NSA, right? And almost anybody who writes about any of that. I suppose at some point you could bring in, although I'm personally not inclined to bring it in, you'd certainly bring it in when you wanted to throw stories on the plate. You'd bring in QAnon, the whole Q conversation. That's not something that I'm either super familiar with. I haven't run down that rabbit hole. Intentionally making reference to the New York Times piece there, but I haven't run down that rabbit hole very hard. But that doesn't mean I don't know it's out there. I mean, you could look at the death of what's his name, Seth
Green. Or no, that's the comedy guy. The
No.
Clinton staffer or whatever.
What was a DNC staffer? A DNC staffer, yeah. Seth Rich, I think, right? Which I think, by the way, is the name of a reporter. I thought a Washington.
I don't know anything about this.
People like accused Clinton of having him assassinated or something. I don't remember the exact story, but
yeah. 4 days after his death, what is it that there's a piece of timing? 4 days after his death, some the documents get were they was the first WikiLeaks dump 4 days after his death, or was it something else? But it was some other notable some other notable public appearance of the so-called stolen files, right? So
which
CrowdStrike is a name that comes up in this context.
I thought people made a connection. I couldn't remember. I would hope it wasn't just he was a staffer and then there was a leak, then he died. Was there any connection to him being?
Oh, there's lots of other things that were said. You can look under Seth Rich in Wikipedia if you want to get, now who on earth knows who edits that? But you
Right.
can certainly get you can certainly see a very a laundry list of accusations that were made and for the most part conservative accusers who
Right.
made those accusations, who chronicled various sorts of stories. And you can find a list of fact-checking organizations that are said to have debunked those stories, Snopes and PolitiFact, and I'm trying to remember the others. But then you're in a smoke-filled room, man. Right? My favorite analogy: you are in a very, very smoke-filled room, and you are in there with professionals who blow smoke for a living. And you need a better analogy than a smoke-filled room, because you sort of need a multicolored smoke-filled room with glasses and of various wavelengths, and who knows what on earth you'd need. I don't know a coherent analogy that actually captures what's going on there, but you have lots of noise from many different frequencies. There's an analogy, right, in which you're trying to find signal. Right. And you have intentional signal intelligence and signal countermeasures, right? And from very many actors, all pouring stuff into the space. And you're supposed to wander in there and figure out what's going on. When you run into those, what's it got to do with our VP? Let me just back out and then turn it back over to you guys. All I mean to say is how much of that, how much of all of that, or of any of that, or of which of that is relevant to thinking through a vice presidential pick and who you get to pick and who you have already said you had to pick and why you had to pick it, right? Pick her, pick him, pick her in this case, right? All of that stuff. And you, yeah, that's in the background. And maybe I'll just say one thing. I probably said it just by mentioning all these things. I'd say that's part of my background when I think about a vice presidential pick. I see it as I greet it with a kind of skepticism. That doesn't mean I'm not interested in. I do think there are some things that happen when you elect people that are relatively predictable, that you might want to change. But I also think there's a bunch of stuff you might want to change that's already locked down and it's out of view. They run by completely different rules, and they're not. You don't get to pick any of it. You get to work for change in that area, but you don't do it by campaigning for particular people. That doesn't mean you won't campaign for particular people for other reasons. You might get some change, but there's about a bunch of stuff that's off the table And it's hard to even know who the actors are in maintaining the status quo, or what are the dynamics that are changing the status quo. And that's all in this multi-wavelength smoke-filled room.
Yeah.
And with that,
I mean, and specifically in relation to the vice presidential pick, I think I used to think it was more important and said something meaningful about the president. I don't think I believe that anymore. I think the vice president, the pick is basically, I don't think it even really has to do with who they like personally. It just has to do with either picking up a voting block that they might not have the best support in, or I've also heard that vice presidents are supposed to be basically the attack dog for the president. So it seems like those are their two main roles. And as a whole, they actually just don't even matter that much. I was listening to, I think it was a podcast by the Nate Silver polling website. And they were talking about how there's been some data on, they paired Biden up with various vice presidents and got some data on how much of a difference it would make as far as voting patterns went. And they compared a bunch of people and it made almost no difference. So yeah, I think I've mostly come to the conclusion that the vice president and that the pick is pretty inconsequential.
is that true of the president? It's a fair question.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people are going to vote against Trump, for example? That they don't really care who the president is, or they might care, but they're going to vote the same way anyway.
You mean they would just vote based on party rather than who the actual person was?
That's right. Yeah. Or how many folks, might vote Republican for similar sets of reasons. It doesn't matter who the Democrats put up. They're not going to vote for any of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that seems to be getting to be more and more the way things are these days, certainly.
I don't know. I feel like Trump wasn't really that in 2016. You know, I mean, I feel like Trump, I mean, a lot of those people voted for Trump eventually, right? But certainly not at the beginning. I mean, him winning the primary was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he sort of against all odds with regards to what the RNC wanted, what the major, the public favorites were.
Yeah, I don't know. I actually don't know. I mean, I know what I read in the papers, and that's the story that I read in the papers.
Mm-hmm.
That people just vote along party lines?
No, that sorry, I was making reference. I was trying to agree with JP's last point. I read that in the papers that that expectations and preferences in the party establishment were sort of anti-Trumpian and surprised by Trump, right? As if they couldn't swat that fly, right? No matter how hard they tried, and then he ended up taking over the whole picnic.
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, which is interesting compared to especially the last election where the complete opposite seemed to have happened. Where in the Republican case, the Republican Party basically lost control. In the DNC case, it seemed like they were able to assert control against what was a pretty strong movement to the opposite.
Yeah.
And then it seems to have basically happened again this year, with what people have described as a moderate coup against Bernie Sanders when the moderates resigned at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then if Kamala Harris is the next presidential nominee or Democratic nominee, basically by virtue of being vice president, the mainstream or the DNC, the political apparatus, the political elites certainly seem to have put themselves in a pretty strong position of control over that party.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really don't have a good way to figure out what's actually going on. Like what's going to happen in the next 8 years. I mean, I could see like clearly clearly there's an element of progressive thinking that isn't allowed or isn't in the same sense that Uncle Tom meant it. And I wonder how, like, what do you look for that actually tells you something about the dynamics of the people in power? Like, I mean, I can see in the next election or just moving forward, just a steady drift towards being more progressive, more socially, more at least like culturally or socially progressive. And I bet there's going to be lots of lip service to that end. But what actually needs to happen? Like, what would have these progressive candidates done? Like, what would have Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard done that Kamala Harris isn't going to do in 6 years? When
Is John gone?
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, I guess. I mean, it depends how strongly the president is in pushing forward his beliefs and how much backing he has from the public and the party. And then that's half, maybe not even half the equation. The other half is whether or not you control the House and the Senate. Because you can have the best.
I missed the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Sorry, John?
Yeah. So I think I was saying part of the equation is how strongly the president believes what he's saying and has the support of his party and the people. And then the other part of the equation is whether or not they control the House and the Senate. Because, I mean, you could have the most progressive candidate in the world or president in the world who wants to push forward a bunch of stuff. And if they don't control the House and the Senate, then they might not get anything done. Or you could have a more moderate president who tries to push forward some more moderate proposals and actually gets something done, even if they don't control both the House and the Senate. So, I mean, I think that's always the balancing act that the moderate wing of the Democratic Party seems to think is the most effective for actually accomplishing change. I don't think I really answered your question, but
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right, but I think I was asking something more along the lines of, like, what's actually not allowed? Like, and how can you tell what is allowed? And are we just, is what's not allowed now going to be allowed in 6 years? Or are there some things that just aren't allowed by the current people doing the allowing? And what are those things? And it seems like those are the issues that are getting people disallowed. And so what are the people who are allowed not doing? What are the people who are allowed to do? And then what are they not doing that it seems like they ought to be allowed to do? And yeah, I don't know. I bet you there's an interesting Venn diagram here of allowed and not allowed.
And how can we do it? Allowed, not allowed, and accomplishable. Anyway,
Yeah.
right? That would be another ring. So what you'd really like to figure out is which among those things you're not allowed to do can you do anyway that you'd really like to do.
Yeah.
Right? That's the target rich environment.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think what complicates an already pretty complicated question is the fact that it does seem
come on, John. Just read the transcript. Control F allowed. Take you right to it.
It does seem like we are going through a period where what is allowed is very up for grabs and changing constantly. Like Trump, by this definition, was not supposed to be allowed to be president. And the fact that he is now president speaks to, I mean, a lot of, I think how what used to be not allowed is changing, and very rapidly, basically.
How about all those things Trump said about foreign policy we've never come remotely close to doing? I mean, he sounded like an isolationist on foreign policy, didn't he?
Certainly.
I mean, didn't Trump himself talk about it, his own hands being tied, right? He had, what was that, ABC News? Maybe I'm misremembering it, but I don't think so. I recall it being an ABC News interview in which he talked about, and maybe I'm wrong about that. He phrased the military industrial complex, for example. Do you remember that? Or did you hear an interview? That's an old phrase and it's not often used anymore. So you would have seen it if it was unusual to have anyone ever bring it up. And he brought it up and he brought it up in connection with what precisely? I'm going to have to remember. It was a particular episode in trying to withdraw. Maybe it had to do with getting out of Syria. That sounds about right. That's the sort of thing he talked about, right? Out of Iraq, out of Iran, out of those things. He's done sort of none of those things. It seems to me, right? And that's, I think, one of those things that's not allowed. And I don't think if you cared about that a lot, you might very well be quite happy, maybe even would have promoted a Trumpian presidency if you knew it was going to happen.
Hmm.
How's he different from Obama? And how is Obama different than Bush?
Yeah.
Just to drop back those last three, maybe not at all. In fact, in some ways, I mean, and there are ways. Killing Soleimani is obviously one of them, right?
Yeah, very direct comparison there.
Yep. So allowed by who? The things that are talked about as allowed and not allowed, and surprise and not a surprise, is one set of things. If you had a lot of money and you were controlling speech with any measure of effectiveness, there would be things that you were not allowed that would not be discussed as not allowed. It's a lot easier to get what you want when nobody knows exactly what you're doing. It's not up for debate, and you don't have to spend any money to maintain it. Or put it this way, you may have to spend an enormous amount of money to maintain it, but you get to spend other people's money to maintain it. Not your own.
Yeah, I forget which president made that military industrial complex speech, but it is a
I
very
think it
interesting.
goes back to Dwight David Eisenhower, but I could be wrong about that. I think that was an Eisenhower.
So if is
Civilization.
the claim that getting out or entirely getting out of the Middle East is not allowed, it would be the military industrial complex that is the force behind that.
I think that's the phrase, that's the way Trump used the phrase in that interview. Yeah. That's the way you use it. I don't know what I think about that. The one thing I think for sure is you got to be skeptical. When there's a lot of money, you got to expect that there's a lot of power and there's a lot of influence and there's a lot of smoke, because you can buy a lot of influence with smoke. That's just obvious. I mean, we have intelligence agencies in every single nation, right? That produce smoke for a living. And so if that's what nations do with their money to get what they want, why would you suppose that private individuals with money aren't in that same game? I mean, it seems to me obvious that they would be in that same game. When there's an enormous transfer of wealth, when there's $1 trillion transfer of wealth, it used to be, they used to say, you spend $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you spend a lot of money. That the trillion is the new billion in that regard. I mean, you have people whose net worth begins to approach $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you certainly have $1 trillion transfers of wealth. That's what happened under the first set of tax cuts. There was transfer of wealth on that level. In the most recent, do I know all this, by the way, or am I dependent on accounts which I read, and how well qualified am I to get to the bottom of these accounts? Frankly, not very. Right. So, but I think, in response to COVID, there has been on the order, to one significant figure, there's been another $1 trillion. It may be less than that, but that's the right order of magnitude of wealth transferred to people who already own billions of dollars apiece. Do I know that? No, I don't know it. I've seen it reported, but you'd have to be transferring it. But anyway, you'd have to be good at really where do you get those figures from? And that, I have some things to say about it, but not an account that I can rely on as to whether those things, how much more is there to it, and where there's smoke and mirrors here. I simply don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there were particular stories that got big in the news of billion-dollar corporations taking huge handouts from COVID. And it took them being like called out in the news media or people paying attention and them getting like named and shamed for them saying, oh, we'll return it. Sorry. But it seems insane to me that that was even like allowed in the first place. Like there should have been a bit more planning in there.
Yeah, it was not only allowed, it was intended. I can't see that any other way. No one makes mistakes with hundreds of billions of dollars. Probably not, right? That's people who make mistakes with that kind of money probably get replaced by people who don't make mistakes with that kind of money pretty quick. It's just hard to imagine for me. Do I do this? Can I prove it? To me, it's common sense.
So that was a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was absolutely take the wealth transfer that took place under the first Trump tax cuts. That was open and shut, absolutely intentional. First of all, Trump talked about it that way with people. So you guys just got a lot richer, right? Number one. Number two, there were mechanisms proposed to cap. Let me see if I can remember any detail really quickly here. If you put money in for a certain purpose, you could prohibit it from being used for other purposes. You could prohibit stock buybacks, which of course is exactly what happened. There were an enormous amount of stock buybacks in that tax break. And so the things, the employment and the trickle down and the bringing of corporations back to the United States, all of those things could have been, and it was suggested that they were required in order to take those tax breaks. But those were explicitly whispered away. The subjects were dropped, right? In other words, nobody wanted to say, no, that's not what we wanted to do, what we want to do. The subjects were just dropped. That's, oh, really? I mean, that's incompetency. Oh gosh, we dropped the ball. And in fact, we had all these buybacks, stock buybacks. In fact, we had, this very large number of dollars of stock buybacks, and no one saw that coming. Although people talked about it, only then we stopped the conversation and then it happened. And that was an accident. Frankly, that's ridiculous to me. That's never an accident.
Yeah. Would it be like the responsibility of the media to do that, or?
You mean the media that's owned by the corporations that benefited from all of that?
Well, yeah, but so
if we had an independent media, yes, but we don't. And by and large,
do we think we had like editors being told they can't run that story and they can't keep that running stories about this if people were upset about it? Or
well, I like the way other people have sometimes put it. It's not so much, it's not that, maybe sometimes that happens, but what more often happens is that the people who are inclined to push hard and get those stories to their editors are not the people that ever got hired. You became one of those people. You became a Tulsi Gabbard, to shift back to an earlier phrase in the conversation, and you just don't get mentioned, right? You're just not one of these. You're just not a top reporter. Too controversial. we're not looking for a controversial reporter. We're looking for people who go after the facts, but who know what to go at. What stories are the stories that matter, right? That is the stories we cover. So you kind of got to think like the rest of us. And if you don't, it will be pretty clear pretty early on in your career that you don't. If you're going to get any good at it, you would have practiced it, you would have accomplished things, and you've gone to work for little tiny publications here and there, not any really big ones.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is interesting. I think this might have been a question that John was bringing up earlier is, as an individual trying to like actually sort through that massive mess of finance and politics and actually trying to figure out what's going on. It almost seems like an impossible task, but
Yeah. Well, I think it's a task that individuals can't handle by themselves. I think you can get better informed by hooking up with others. But I think even assessing who the others are, let's see, how do I put this? I think you could become generally better informed, more probably better informed by mixing and matching your sources of information. But I think there's a lot of work to do that. And that work tends to tax an individual's capabilities. It would be a lot better if a group of people did that. It'd be a lot better and then that group of people might have, because of the whole set of sources that they filter together and process together. We've done a lot of this, and you can tell I'm sort of stuck in my rich community thinking here, but also not just rich community, maybe even a rich think tank. When it comes to these things, still it's hard to even know what to aim at. It's how do you assemble enough people that share a common set of values and that are really after effective promotion of those values? How do you do that on any large scale? And then how do you tell who else is doing it, who else is opposed to it, etc.? That's really quite a challenge. I don't think it's insurmountable challenge, but I think we are too lightly equipped, too lightly armed for meeting that challenge now. And I think now the best you can do is sort of survive and hang on to certainly hang on to the skill sets you need to process different perspectives, and hang on to multiple information sources that you, so far as you know, these are a somewhat of a reasonable. You ought to listen to what these folks have to say, although you don't really know them well enough to know why they're saying it. That's much harder to do. And then you try to develop some rules, like if you look around to a number of independent sources long enough, important things will probably emerge somewhere sometime. A rule of thumb like that. And you start to track things and apply your own judgments to what things seem important and what things are getting press and what things are not, what things are just dropping out of coverage that seem important, and why is that? And if they are important, who's not letting them drop, and why is that? Right? Those are sort of links, I think, that you can begin to make. You could begin to assemble lists of people that you listen to. But you could spend all your time doing this.
Right. Yeah. Which, yeah.
It's
most people can't. And even for the people who can, it might not always be the best use of your time.
No, that's right. That's a good question. What is civic responsibility to be informed these days? What does that look like? That's a really good question. And I've been trying to outline a little bit of an approach to it in the last couple minutes there, but I think that it needs to be done with a lot more care. Well, thanks, guys. We should quit at some point, and we're leaving at, when we're looking at some big principle, is probably a good place to quit. Unless somebody's got a last thought they want to add to it, something stuck in your craw.
No, that was great. Definitely, yeah. A lot to think about for sure. And yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation just given how just the general media sources were just so, I don't know, everything, like all the media I was looking at the last couple days has just seemed so packaged. Like there was just this particular story that we're telling about the vice presidential pick, and
Yep.
I don't know, it just felt very what's the word? I don't know, prepared, polished,
Official.
yeah, superficial. So yeah, I don't know. This is something I want to get better at, is this sort of understanding, being able to really get to the bottom of what's happening and figuring out what I should actually care about with regards to politics, because it is a total, you could spend a lot of time on this and not really get a lot out of it except emotional catharsis maybe, or emotional or just being upset about stuff.
Yeah.
So that doesn't strike me as a good use of energy. So I'd like to actually understand what's going on. And yeah, I don't know, maybe this is something we just keep talking about, and we keep doing stuff like this on Wednesdays, then maybe we do this for a while and we'll actually talk about stuff that is emerging, and I don't know, maybe get a clue about what's really going on, what's allowed, what's not allowed.
What's allowed and by who? That's what I wrote as a little summary of this open topic discussion. VP pick, background narratives, what's allowed by who.
Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Something like that. And how do you know and who do you listen to? So thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Uncle Tom. That was great.
Some time. All right, we'll connect again Friday.
All right, sounds
Alrighty.
good.
That was good.
See you then.
So, yeah.
This one.